When a good man stops being emotionally available, something subtle but deeply structural begins to shift in the relationship dynamic. At first glance, it may not look like a dramatic event. There is no sudden collapse, no obvious rupture. Instead, what changes is something far more important. The flow of emotional energy that once moved almost automatically between him and her begins to slow down, then weaken, and eventually withdraw. In many imbalanced relationships, one person becomes the emotional regulator for the other. The good man often unconsciously takes on the role of stabilizing tension, explaining misunderstandings, absorbing emotional volatility, and maintaining peace through constant engagement. Over time, this creates a system where his presence is not just desired, it is relied upon. His attention becomes a form of structure, quietly holding the dynamic together. But when he begins to step back, not out of anger but out of awareness, that structure starts to dissolve. He stops over-explaining himself. He no longer rushes to fix emotional discomfort that is not his responsibility. He becomes more selective with his energy, more deliberate with his responses, and or anchored in his own inner world. This is not withdrawal in the emotional sense, it is redistribution of attention back toward the self. From a psychological perspective, this is significant because it interrupts a pattern of dependency. A controlling personality often relies on predictable emotional access. When that access is no longer guaranteed, the system loses its stability. What once felt automatic, his reassurance, his presence, his emotional availability, becomes uncertain. And uncertainty forces confrontation with something that was previously avoided: the absence of control. Carl Jung spoke about the importance of withdrawing projections in order to see reality more clearly. In this context, the good man is no longer functioning as a projection screen for emotional needs that do not belong entirely to him. He is no longer unconsciously playing the role assigned to him in the dynamic. Instead, he begins to re-establish himself as a separate psychological entity, with his own boundaries, needs, and direction. This shift is often misunderstood at first. It may be interpreted as distance, disinterest, or even rejection. But in reality, it is clarity. It is the moment when emotional overfunctioning gives way to self-awareness. And in that space, something becomes undeniable. You cannot maintain control over someone who is no longer emotionally governed by your reactions. And that realization is where the real transformation begins, not in the other person, but in the return of emotional sovereignty. Because the moment a good man stops being emotionally available, he is no longer being shaped by the relationship, he starts shaping his own life. When his emotional availability disappears, the first thing that begins to shift is the effectiveness of control itself. What once worked almost effortlessly, guilt, emotional pressure, subtle testing, or shifting mood, starts to lose its impact. Not because the methods suddenly change, but because the target no longer responds in the same predictable way. And in dynamics built on emotional influence, predictability is everything. At the core of controlling behavior is a simple psychological expectation that emotional input will produce emotional output. If tension is created, a reaction will follow. If silence is used, discomfort will pull the other person back in. If guilt is applied, compliance will remain. Rebalance. But when a person becomes internally grounded, that loop begins to break. The response is no longer immediate, emotional, or automatic. Instead, there is pause. There is observation. Sometimes there is no reaction at all. This is where confusion enters the system, not because anything dramatic is happening externally, but because the internal feedback mechanism stops working. The usual emotional buttons are pressed, but the expected response does not arrive in the same way. And when influence stops producing results, control starts to feel like it is slipping, not gradually, but noticeably. From a deeper psychological perspective, this is not just a behavioral shift, it is a structural change in the relationship dynamic. The good man is no longer operating as an emotional extension of the situation. He is no longer unconsciously adjusting himself to maintain equilibrium. Instead, he is responding from a place of self-reference rather than external pressure. That distinction is critical, because control only exists where emotional dependence exists. Carl Jung's idea of individuation is useful here, the process of becoming psychologically whole and separate from the unconscious, conscious roles and expectations. In this stage, the man is no longer fused with the emotional system of the relationship. He is beginning to see it, rather than being inside it. And once you see a pattern clearly, you are no longer fully controlled by it. Naturally, the loss of influence creates resistance. There may be attempts to re-engage the old emotional rhythm, to recreate urgency, to provoke a familiar reaction. But what is really being tested is not love or connection, it is whether the old system still works. And increasingly, it does not. What feels like losing control is actually the exposure of dependency on emotional predictability. And when that predictability breaks, the dynamic can no longer function in the same way. Because the moment emotional control stops working, the illusion of power begins to collapse. When emotional control no longer produces a reaction, something even deeper begins to surface: silence. Not just the absence of words, but the absence of emotional engagement. And for someone who is used to influencing the emotional state of another person, this silence can feel far louder than any argument ever did. At first, it may seem insignificant. We are no dramatic confrontations, no visible breakdowns in communication. On the surface, things may even appear calmer than before. But psychologically, this calm carries a different weight, because it is not peace born from harmony, it is distance born from detachment. And detachment removes the emotional feedback loop that once gave the dynamic its sense of stability. The good man in this phase is no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. He is present but not reactive. He listens but does not absorb. He observes but does not internalize. This creates a psychological gap that cannot easily be filled with familiar tactics. Where there was once emotional engagement, there is now neutrality. And neutrality is difficult to influence, because it offers nothing to push against. From a deeper psychological lens, silence introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty challenges control at its foundation. When responses were predictable, the dynamic felt manageable. But when responses become minimal or emotionally neutral, the system loses its reference points. There is no longer a reliable way to anticipate or direct the other person's inner state. Carl Jung's perspective on the unconscious becomes relevant here. What is not met with awareness tends to project itself outward. In this case, the absence of emotional reaction can trigger internal discomfort because it removes the familiar reflection that once confirmed influence. The silence becomes a mirror, not of validation, but of unpredictability. And in that unpredictability, the mind naturally begins to search for answers. What changed? Why is the emotional response no longer the same? What is being done differently? These questions arise not because something is being actively communicated, but because something expected is missing. Yet the most important aspect of this silence is not what it does to the other person, it is what it does to the man himself. Because in maintaining emotional distance, he is no longer being pulled into cycles that once consumed his attention. He is no longer reacting from obligation or emotional reflex. He is simply not participating in the same way anymore. And this is where the deeper realization begins to take shape. Silence is not emptiness, it is separation. Because the moment silence replaces reaction, control is no longer being challenged, it is being outgrown. When previous patterns stop working, the natural next move is an attempt to restore what once existed. Not necessarily in a direct or obvious way, but through subtle efforts to rebuild the emotional rhythm that has now been disrupted. The system, in a sense, tries to correct itself by returning to familiarity. At this stage, the focus is not truly on connection, it is on restoration. Restoration of attention, restoration of emotional access, restoration of the dynamic where reactions were predictable and engagement was consistent. This can appear in different forms: sudden emotional intensity, shifts between warmth and distance, reemergence of past emotional narratives, or attempts to reopen unresolved conversations. On the surface, it may look like communication, but underneath, it is an effort to re-establish influence. Psychologically, this happens because the loss of emotional responsiveness creates instability in the existing framework. When someone no longer reacts in expected ways, it creates a gap that feels unresolved, and the mind often seeks resolution not through understanding, but through re-engagement with what feels familiar. So instead of adapting to the new dynamics, there is a pull toward reactivating the old one. The good man, however, is no longer operating from within that previous structure. He is no longer easily drawn into emotional cycles that once defined the interaction. He recognizes the pattern without being absorbed by it. This is a crucial shift. Awareness replaces participation. He sees the attempt to restore the old dynamic, but he does not automatically step back into it. From a Jungian perspective, this moment reflects the tension between the familiar persona and emerging individuation. The old dynamic represented a role, one that may have involved emotional availability, responsiveness, or constant relational adjustment. But individuation requires the loosening of those unconscious roles. And when one person in the dynamic begins to change, the entire structure is forced to reveal itself. What often follows is not immediate acceptance, but persistence. Because when influence begins to weaken, the system tends to intensify its efforts before letting go. Emotional extremes may surface not because of clarity, but because of resistance to change. Yet beneath all of it is a simple truth. What is being sought is not just attention, but restoration of control through familiarity. The important shift, however, is that the man is no longer responding from familiarity. He is responding from awareness. And awareness does not easily revert to old patterns once they are seen clearly. And this is the turning point. When someone tries to pull you back into an old version of yourself, it is often because they can no longer access the new one. When a man begins to choose self-respect over repetition, something fundamental shifts in the entire emotional structure of the relationship. This is no longer about reacting to behavior or even understanding patterns. It becomes about deciding what he is willing to continue participating in. And that decision quietly changes everything. In many imbalanced dynamics, repetition becomes the trap. The same cycles replay in different forms: tension, reconciliation, emotional intensity, temporary calm, and then disruption again. Over time, the mind can confuse repetition with stability, even when the experience itself is draining. What feels familiar is often mistaken for what is meaningful. But familiarity is not the same as health. At this stage, the good man starts to recognize that peace is not found in resolving the same conflict repeatedly, but in stepping out of the pattern that keeps generating it. He no longer feels compelled to explain himself endlessly, to justify his boundaries, or to re-enter emotional loops that lead nowhere new. Instead, he begins to prioritize clarity over confusion, even if clarity creates distance. From a psychological perspective, this is where self-respect becomes an internal anchor. It is not about asserting superiority or withdrawing out of punishment. It is about alignment, choosing not to engage in dynamics that repeatedly require self-abandonment to maintain connection. The man is no longer asking, "How do I fix this?" but rather, "What is this doing to me over time?" Carl Jung's concept of individuation is deeply relevant here. Individuation is not just self-awareness. It is the courage to separate from unconscious patterns that keep a person emotionally entangled in roles they no longer need to play. In this case, the man is stepping out of the role of constant emotional stabilizer. He is no longer compensating for imbalance by over-functioning emotionally. This shift often creates discomfort in the system because it removes predictability. But internally, something stabilizes within him. He is no longer negotiating his sense of worth through emotional endurance. He begins to understand that staying in a cycle does not make him loyal, it makes him unavailable to himself. And so, decisions become simpler, not easier but clearer. He does not stay because of fear of loss, nor does he leave impulsively. He simply evaluates whether continued participation aligns with his well-being. If it does not, repetition loses its hold. What emerges here is a quiet form of strength, not loud, not reactive, but grounded. A strength that does not need to prove itself because it is expressed through choice rather than conflict. And this is the real transformation. When self-respect becomes stronger than emotional habit, repetition loses its authority over your life. When a man no longer participates in the emotional patterns that once defined the relationship, he begins to see the relationship for what it is: a toxic and unhealthy dynamic. Something unexpected happens. Absence begins to speak louder than presence ever did. Not absence in the physical sense alone, but the absence of emotional availability, reaction, and attachment to the dynamic itself. This is where the situation moves from change to revelation. Without his reactions, the structure that once depended on emotional exchange begins to lose its meaning. There is no longer a consistent emotional mirror reflecting back validation, conflict, or resolution. And in that absence, something unavoidable emerges: a direct encounter with the reality of the dynamic itself, without distortion or emotional buffering. From a psychological standpoint, this moment is significant because it removes the stabilizing role that the man unknowingly played. In many relational systems, one person becomes the emotional regulator, absorbing tension, providing responses, and maintaining balance even when the system is unhealthy. When that role is withdrawn, the system is no longer supported in the same way. What remains is not collapse in a dramatic sense, but exposure. Carl Jung often emphasized that what we avoid internally eventually confronts us externally. In this context, The absence of the man's emotional participation removes the projection surface that once helped maintain a certain narrative. Without that surface, the emotional landscape becomes more transparent. Patterns that were once softened by interact ion now appear more clearly in isolation. This clarity can be uncomfortable because it does not rely on reaction, persuasion, or emotional engagement anymore. There is nothing left to interpret through another person's responses. Instead, there is only the situation as it is, without reinforcement. And in that state, any illusion of control or certainty begins to weaken. It is important to understand that this is not about punishment or emotional consequence. It is about psychological exposure. When a dynamic is sustained through interaction, it can feel balanced even if it is not. But when one side steps out of participation, the imbalance becomes visible without interference. The man in this stage is no longer shaping the emotional environment. He is no longer adjusting himself to maintain comfort or predictability. He has moved into a state of non-participation in the old pattern. And that non-participation becomes the most defining factor of all. What is revealed in this silence is not just the end of control, but the beginning of awareness on both sides. One person no longer reacts, and the system can no longer rely on reaction to define itself. And this is the final R, realization. When emotional presence is withdrawn completely, the truth of the connection no longer needs to be spoken, it becomes visible on its own. Some people fear losing control more than losing love. Subscribe if you're learning to choose peace over manipulation.